Welcome to Breaking News with Ben Hunt, Jack Forehand, and Matt Ziegler. Before we start, let me remind you what the show is not. Breaking News is not a show about fact-checking. Breaking News is not a show about saying whose bias is the one and only correct bias. And Breaking News is definitely not a show about calling out fake news. Breaking News is a show where we look at today's top stories and have a conversation around our favorite critical question, why am I reading this now? Drawing on the headlines we're tracking at fiatnews.com, join us as we talk about what's collectively making us tick, with clear eyes, full hearts, and this obligatory disclaimer. Nothing in this podcast is advising you to buy or sell any security or to do anything with your money. Seriously, you should only act on investment advice from someone you know and someone who knows your unique situation. We are not that person.
Welcome back to Breaking News. I'm Matt Ziegler. That's Ben Hunt, and that's Jack Forehand. Hi, guys. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt. Good to be back.
This is the Optimism episode. I know people have been asking for it. We've all been crying for it, crying ourselves to sleep every night, looking for these signs of optimism. We're going to try to deliver them today because we see them. And that's part of doing the show is we actually see these as reasons for optimism, which is a beautiful thing. So we're better to start, Ben, than with you and the widening gyre. And I think just let's step back for a second. Let's talk about what is it? Why is it widening? And how did we get what we're all feeling? The cry for optimism is because we feel so far apart right now. So maybe just give us that. What's the widening gyre? Why is it widening? How did we get so far apart?
So I'll use an example that we're recording this on, today, October 6th. And yesterday, the House of Representatives voted out the Speaker of the House, right? Voted him out of office. Even though a supermajority within his own party and within the House overall prefer Kevin McCarthy, that speaker. How does that happen? How does that happen? And the answer is, I think, is a microcosm of the widening gyre. The widening gyre, effectively, this is the famous poem where the center does not hold. The center does not hold. We've been talking about this on a national sense, about how political candidates in $10 word alert bimodal distributions, they become more and more extreme, either on the right or on the left, to be successful within their own party, and that hollows out the middle of the overall electorate. Well, guys, we saw exactly that happen with a much smaller group, the House of Representatives, where it took all of 10, it ended up being 10 Republicans out of 220, I think it is. Call it 5%, less than 5%, to say, nope, we're going to put the whole situation into chaos. And it didn't have to go to chaos because the Democrats, well, they could have voted to keep the existing speaker and to keep some semblance of moving forward. And they had just passed the budget resolution and they want to get the Ukraine support bill and all like that. They could have prevented all of this from happening. And they didn't. They preferred to chaos, which I get. I'm not ascribing blame in this situation. We're just describing what is. You ask, what is the widening gyre? And it is self-interested individuals and organizations where their self-interest pushes them farther and farther from a common ground. Even though, if you step back, an enormous majority, both in the House and in the overall electorate, prefer that common ground. So you see this a lot in social systems. You see it a lot in markets. You see it a lot in politics, where even though a strong supermajority may have a preference for a centrist outcome, the rules of the system prevent that centrist outcome from happening. And yes, there's a great example. The rules of the system, whereby it only takes one angry Republican or Democrat, whoever's, party is controlling the speakership, to set this whole thing in motion. And once you set it in motion, the structural incentives push everyone apart. It's the same with our primary elections. It's the same with our general election today. And we saw it with the House of Representatives yesterday. So there's the widening gyre in action. Nobody wanted that to occur, but the incentives, the structure means that is what occurs. And the question is, how do we break out of that? How do we break out of that? That's what we got to figure out.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it's not just, in politics too, or like in the House of Representatives. I was noticing this is exactly what happens on Twitter too. The very, very loud minority wins. The majority of us who, the person who says, let's look at both sides and let's analyze the issue, that tweet goes nowhere. And the people that are screaming and yelling on both sides, that goes to the top.
100%. Right. So we live in this rage engagement world, particularly on social media. We've become a social media world where what these systems reward on an individual level is engagement. Also rewards it on a corporate level. That's how Facebook makes money, is your engagement. You can engage with something because you really like it. Oh, the little kitten hanging by its claws in that queue. But so much more effective are other kinds of engagements. And, we've written about two. One is called mirror engagements. And a mirror engagement is when you react very positively when I'm not going to say famous, but a person with a big following says something that mirrors something you've always said. Yes, go get them. Yes, I've been saying that for years. You're absolutely right. So a mirror engagement. Even more powerful is the rage engagement, where, and I get this all the time, right? People follow me and respond to me because I make them angry. And that rush of, I'm going to deliver this, terribly effective response to this person who I just don't like. That's an enormous brain chemical norepinephrine releaser, right? It's not dopamine. It's not it's the, yes, I'm going to fight you. And this is what drives the economics of social media. It's increasingly what drives, I'll call it, the political economy of voting. It all ends up with a widening gyre.
Can you just put this in the context? And we're going to get to the positivity here in a second.
Yes,
but
we really are.
We are, I promise. But in terms of history, where are we? Like, have we seen other periods like this? Is this potentially one of the worst periods? Like, how would you put this in the context of history?
So I used to be a political scientist of all oxymorons, and I regret having the science part of that word. But anyway, I came from the background, and there is science. There's game theory. It really is a science. There's real math, right? We have the econometrics and statistics and real data analysis. So the hard part for measuring polarization is, well, once you go back 20 years ago, what are you measuring? It's we don't have the same sort of media indicators and data on everything we did there. What we do have are voting records. So what you can track is how far apart Congress is in their voting records. Do you have bipartisan legislation? Do you have people in Congress who vote on, with different majorities? Or is it like one side over here, one side over there, and that's all you got? We can absolutely track that. And what you see is that the polarization we see in legislation today is only matched by the polarization we saw in the 1930s, which was, in fact, the last time we had, I'll call it populist political movements, very much on the extreme, very much a widening gyre as well. The last time we were in a fourth turning, to refer to something we've talked about here. And it was very much up in the air in the 1930s about whether, well, let me tell you that it wasn't up in the air. The notion of conflict, violent conflict, being the end of this polarization was absolutely present in the 1930s. But people didn't think it would be us Americans fighting the Germans, the Japanese. No, that we'd be fighting ourselves, right? You had communists and fascists, marching and fighting in the streets in the United States, like Antifa and, Proud Boys mixing it up. Very similar dynamic. So has this happened before? Yes. We absolutely saw this clearly in the voting records in the 1930s. You go back to the election of 1860 as another election that, like we talked about last time, was incredibly divisive and destructive for the country. It's a little bit different situation because you had the Democrats. They were split. There were the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. They split the vote. Number 3, Abe Lincoln, Republican, comes in and wins the presidency. So it was and there was a fourth candidate as well. I forget his name, Knox, something like that. Well, I think won Missouri. But anyway, the point being is that it wasn't as solidified as a two-party system as we have today. Obviously, you don't have the media and the social media systems. You don't have the same personal incentives we were describing earlier. But those would be the examples in history. 1860 for an election that obviously divided the country and was enormously destructive. And then the 1930s for a period of time where our general politics was also incredibly polarized, where people really thought, well, I think the outcome here is, domestic organized violence, as we obviously saw in 1860.
You mentioned the fourth turning, so I just wanted to pick up on that quick, because I think maybe what comes in the wake of that is part of our reason for optimism, because if I don't understand generational theory as well as you and Matt do, but I believe the first turning, which I think he calls the high, is actually a very positive period. It's the most positive period of all of them. So, I mean, is that a reason for optimism that, we're going through some tough times now, but in the wake of this, we're going to have a more positive situation?
It's positive in the sense that it's better than the fourth turning, right? Because the fourth turning ends in violence. Period. End of story. It ends in violence. Sometimes that violence is domestic conflict. Sometimes that violence is international conflict, but it ends badly. It ends badly. So in that sense, the first turning is a reclaiming of identity. It is certainly better than the fourth turning. It is a bit of a rebirth of the cycle, but it's not all peaches and cream, right? So the first turning, what comes out of the violence, whatever equilibrium, again, use those $10 words, whatever balancing point of individual incentives and structural rules, what comes out of the violence is a period of great conformity, right? I mean, I can give you examples of a first turning. It was a first turning with the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, right? And it's a first turning in the aftermath of the Chinese Revolution. Neither of those societies, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, I think we would look at and say, woohoo, isn't that great? So I think it's a mistake to think of what comes out of the conflict to come as necessarily great, right? But it has the potential to be great. And I think when we talk about how to maintain optimism, how are we to live our lives in a world that is falling apart, that is polarized, that is a widening gyre? How do we live our lives? That's what we're talking about.
One of the piece, and I think it's It's the how do we live our lives part, and the generational component of it that fascinated me by Howe's work is even in those, what we'll call like the negative scenarios of the less desirable turnings that we really hope we're not headed towards one of those, is that the hero generation, as in his language, but really it's just like, who are the people who are the midlifers at the turn, at that fourth turning into that new future? And something that's so interesting when we look at these historical examples, I take this, so this is just me as a symbol of optimism here. The generation who is going through the midlife crisis now is largely made up of the generation who helped herald in this new media that's contributed to a lot of these problems. And I can't help but think and wonder that the midlife crises that are occurring across this generation, with so many things that were like, Facebook is cool, Twitter, and now X, and all these things are cool, and we learned how to live as adults in these. This generation is now dealing with both children and parents and other people, and they're like, crap, some of this stuff is not doing what we wanted it to do.
Yep.
And they're going to mature into the 50 and 60-year-olds as we move the rest of the way through this cycle, who go, we thought we understood this and we didn't understand this. I think that coming home to roost in the midlife crises that are happening right now is possibly one of the best corrective mechanisms for what we're about to go through in whatever the end of this turning looks like.
I agree with that, Matt. And I think we can think of it in a couple of different ways. I think a lot of people are realizing that their job is not their identity.
Yes.
That they are more than their job, that their job does not define them. And frankly, I want to go farther than that. We can talk about this later. Your political party doesn't define you either. It really doesn't. I will say, though, that I'll take some, I find this to be I'll call it a weakness of generational theory, because it ascribes people to these not hard and fast, but pretty distinct groupings based on age and life. I mean, I feel like I had my midlife crisis when I was 28. You know, I mean, I think everyone kind of goes through their questioning of, is that all there is?
We're not subjecting to Jungian analysis for the sake of this podcast.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
Continue, please.
No,
Please continue. Like at 28. So go ahead. Give us
it's not about me being 28. My point is that I don't think I think it'd be unhelpful to say, oh, you know, the boomers, the millennials. I think it can be a useful thing. But my point here is that what you're saying, Matt, applies to us regardless of what age,
100%,
regardless of the generation. That's my point, right? That when we talk about how do we live our lives, it's not how do I live my life as a boomer or a millennial or a, Gen Zer. It's how do I live my life as a thinking, feeling human being, regardless of age. So we're on exactly the same track. I just don't, and this is an issue I have with generational theory. I think it can become a crutch to say, oh, it's that group over there that's the problem, and they need to get their act together. And you see this with African communities. So, the Vivek says, okay, we're not going to let, if you're under 25, you can't vote. Right? I mean, come on, give me a break. Or, oh, it's, on those sides, it's the boomers. It's all their fault. It's all of us.
The crutch inside of it. And I think I agree. I think this is one of the, I don't want to say missing components, but it's in there. But I went into the appendix not long ago in the new Fourth Turning book. And I was like, Young gets his fair share of mentions, but a critical part of like that midlife crisis is the move from magical thinking to heroic thinking to realistic thinking. Mm-hmm. And when we start labeling, we open ourselves up to that widening gyre. We start lining ourselves up to go, okay, boomer, okay, trophy kid, and all the crap. But when we start to understand all that move away from, because we can have people from every corner who have the gift of young is saying you can mature past that part. But lots of people get stuck. There's lots of adults still stuck with magical thinking. there's lots of adults still stuck with heroic thinking. And there's the occasional 28-year-old who's figured out his way into realism. And it's finding those people, because realistic thinking, back to your point, is when you've realized that, oh no, my job doesn't actually define me. Like, it's defined by these relationships around me. And then those are the people we have to figure out how to connect, it feels like.
100%.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where we wanted to go next, is like, no matter what's going on around us, I feel like those relationships, that pack, as you call it, we surround ourselves with, is a huge part of our positivity as human beings. And it's a huge part of, if we are in for some ugly times, it's a huge part of how we get through that. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we find those people. It's very hard these days. I was mentioning in our last episode, like, it's hard in Georgia, when I saw a lot of people on the right side, and in Connecticut, when I saw a lot of people on the left side, it's hard to have conversations about these things because it immediately triggers people. So I'm just wondering, how do we find that pack? What are your tips in terms of how we can find that group of people that helps us in a tough period like this?
Twofold, right? The first is and I think this is the most important one, is that when we meet someone, we all have projections of ourselves. Right? I mean, so it's a surface, it's a barrier between who we are, who I am, Ben Hunt, and who you are, Jack Forehand. Right? And we all put these things up, and often, at least I find particularly with men, right? Over a certain age, that projection is, this is my job. This is who I am. And you interact with that, right? If you meet somebody for the first time, you're interacting with that projection. Depending on the context, it could be, oh, I'm interacting with this person because of the politics. I'm interacting with this person because of, one way of overcoming these barriers you often see is that you're in college, you make friends on the basis of, oh, I'm sharing this class, this interest, or I'm at the same party, or there's some shared interest. So it's much more amorphous, and it's easier, I think, to break through to who that real person is. So you make friends at college. I think similarly, again, you see this kind of in people with young kids, they make friends through their children in school events, right? Where the projection, the place where you meet, is not on the basis of what's your job or what's your political party. Because when they say, hey, your kid and my kid, they're both in Mrs. Jones' class. And so you make a connection that way. So I think that the key to all of this is to try to find ways to make connections with what I mean by like-minded people. And that could be, oh, we've got kids the same age. That could be, oh, we have a shared interest in bowling or woodworking or crocheting. Right?
Shout out bowling.
Shout out to bowling.
Absolutely.
So there's that, and I'll go farther. Here are the shared interests that I think are totally non-conducive to making a true connection. And that's if the projection or the point of contact is work and politics. I think religion used to be one of those, right? So you don't talk about, those three things, religion and politics. Work can be an icebreaker. That's what I use all the time. Tell me about what you do. And I'm actually seriously interested. And I think that's like most people, when you ask them that conversation, because they want to tell you what they do, because they see their identity as being inextricably intertwined with what they do for work. I think what we're increasingly seeing over the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and I think what makes actually our world very different from the 1930s, I think, is that more and more people are seeing their identity formed by their politics. And this is absolutely intentional by the political parties. It's also intentional by the corporation you work for. Like you want that. You work for Google. You're proud you work for Google. Google wants you to think of you're part of the Google family, right? That this is your identity. Same with the political party. And it's not because they care about you intrinsically. It's because they care about you as a means to an end. This is the defining difference between a pack, friendships, connections that are meaningful in overcoming the widening gyre, and connections that are not. You have to be connected with people who do not see you as a means to an end. If you're dealing with people on an instrumental basis, what can you do for me? They are going to be dealing with you in the same way. What can you do for them? When you deal with people in an instrumental, on a transactional basis, that's a relationship, and you can have it, and we've all got them, but those do not overcome the widening gyre. In the worst case, particularly in the political sense, they exacerbate it. So that, a little long-winded, but I think it's an important answer. What we're looking for are connections that are not transactional, that are not instrumental, where you are dealing with someone as an end in themselves, and you insist that they treat you the same. The latter part is really important. You insist that they treat you the same way, not as a means to an end.
This thing you said about the wall is something like I would definitely criticize myself for. Is like, I feel like in the world we live in today, it's harder and harder you have this wall between what you want to say and then this protection layer that sits there that prevents you from saying it, because so many things, more and more things are getting on the list of, well, you can't talk about that, or you can't talk about that. Or even when, obviously I have a business, and when I post on Twitter, like you read the thing 5 times just to make sure there's nothing that's going to be like attacked in there. I think it's harder and harder. I mean, I don't know if this is true relative to history, but I feel like personally for me, it has been harder and harder to deal with that.
Well, here's the hard part, Jack. And you pushed out when he said Twitter, right? Twitter is forever. Twitter's forever. And I really mean that. What you write down, when you send that post button, man, it's gone. And it's not going to get erased. It doesn't go away. It's not like an individual conversation. Our human brains are actually quite forgiving. And we'll have a conversation with someone, and over the years, the edges get a little frayed in terms of, maybe said the wrong thing. I'm sorry, I apologize to the other person, the person who hears it. It's always going to be the wrong thing you said, but it softens over time. Nothing softens in social media over time. It doesn't soften. And we're in an age where both the sensitivity of people who see you transactionally to you saying the wrong thing, we all have to go through the presupposition that we meet someone that they're more likely to be seeing us instrumentally than as a human being. No, it's exactly right, Jack. That whether it's in our spoken written word or even when we meet someone individually, I find myself withdrawing and not putting myself out there. And it's a tragedy.
Are you guys familiar with, do you know Michael Bungay Stanier? Has he crossed into your lives or spheres? Yeah. So Michael Bungay Stanier, fantastic coaching, stuff like that. Think of him almost like a coach's Seth Godin. He's on that level. He's got this thing called the best possible relationship. So just, this is worth saying in this context. I wrote this down. When you commit to a best possible relationship, you commit to intentionally designing and managing the way you work with people rather than just accepting what happens. And I think he invokes Esther Perel. He says, love is a verb. And he adds, so stop leaving it to chance. So we intentionally design and manage the way we work with people rather than just accepting what happens. And that we do that to create relationships that are safe, vital, and repairable.
Yep.
And this is the really important part when we're doing this, because this is transactional versus relational. It's safe, meaning we help create psychological safety to discuss anything that's appropriate to discuss. Don't put it in stone. Maybe like write this down in something that can wash away. It's vital, meaning it's an important relationship. So we're treating the others as vital and the relationship as vital to our living selves. We don't want to kill it off. And then that repairable part, which I think that's one of the hardest ones right now for so many people.
I want to focus on that. Yeah.
Please, let's talk about what that means.
Because what you just quoted, it resonates, right? But what I want to provide is actually some, again, political science, but support for that, because the best, this isn't just from political science, but the best work in game theory today, I think, comes from linguistics, and it comes from evolutionary biology. And we focus on the evolutionary biology part. So the question is, there's an adaptation. Let's say it's a social adaptation for cooperating within a larger population that doesn't cooperate with each other. Your question initially, Jack, how do the cooperators find each other? And then the language, how do they stay together? Because what's absolutely right is that if cooperators can find each other and stick together, right, if they can repair their relationships, man, across the, random ways in which relationships break apart, they as a group can absolutely thrive. And in, an evolutionary biology sense, that group becomes larger over time, so that you end up with a society that's just more cooperative and better for more people. So how do you do that? And there are a lot of they do these sort of tournaments with very simple applications of this called Prisoner's Dilemma, repeat game stuff, and they run tournaments. What's the strategy for when you meet someone and then you have to do interactions with them? Do you cooperate with them? If you both cooperate, you're both better off. But if you cooperate and they defect, they punch you, they get a much larger reward and you get the sucker payoff. You get nothing. So, the equilibrium, the balancing point of a single play, Prisoner's Dilemma, is always neither side cooperates. But that's not the real world. We live in a world where we interact with the people and some of the same people over and over and over again. How can we find those who are willing to cooperate? How can we forgive those who maybe punch us once, but could learn to cooperate? How do we do that? And that the most successful strategy in these repeat play Prisoner's Dilemma tournaments, where your different strategies are competing against each other, is a strategy that is willing to take the L. Right? You start off saying, here I am, I believe in myself. If you're going to punch me in the nose, all right, go ahead and punch me in the nose. But I am putting myself out there for a cooperative outcome. And, you'll find other people say, no, I'll cooperate with you. And then you say, great, we're cooperating, we're together. Now, you also somebody might just say, okay, you're cooperating, but bam, right in the nose. I'll take the sucker pay from you. And at that point, it's like, all right, you had your chance. For us to have a relationship again, I'm still available to cooperate, but I'm only going to cooperate if you leave yourself open first to take the L. Right? So it's forgiving, but it's not a patsy.
Right.
That's it. You forgive, but you don't tolerate those who demonstrate an unwillingness to forgive you.
That middle point, that like the safe, vital, repairable, like the vital piece refers to the vitality of the relationship from both sides. And if I sense you want to kill me, then that needs to be the boundary that we walk, like one of us where we both defect and walk away from.
Yeah,
but if we
it's
can
not
both
safe.
say, yeah, like because it's not safe and therefore not worthy of repair.
Forgiving, but not a patsy. That's the general strategy. And I think it's encapsulated in much better words than what you said, but that's the strategy. And that's what the question I was dealing with earlier is how do we put ourselves in a situation where we have, let's say, a target-rich environment for cooperative relationships? And I think that almost never comes in if we're approaching it from my identity is my politics. I think it's difficult for it to happen if your identity is that of your job. But I think it's much more available if your identity is, this is what I care about. This is what I care about on a human level.
So take us, I want to read this because that part about like the bottom up mentality, I think is really important here. And I want to read this. This came from Matthew P. in the Epsilon Theory forums, which we encourage you to come join us in. Solving big problems from the bottom up, being additive to society through make, protect, teach, and ultimately finding and supporting your pack with clear eyes and full hearts, which is the opposite of having head in the sand or blindly following a political herd. And it takes tremendous courage. That bottom-up mentality, this whole idea of make, protect, teach, not because our identity orders us to do so in some monotonous automaton way, but like, how do you think about the bottom-up mentality that's essential to the core of our being to do this?
Is recognizing the innate humanness of the person you're having a conversation with and allowing yourself to be open, showing them your humanness, showing them you're a human being. See how they respond. If they respond by MAGA this or woke that, then it's like, okay, I'm not disliking you, but I'm not, and I may have to engage with you for business or some sort of transactional relationship. That's great, but we're not friends. Now, you may come to me later and you may open up and say, well, I mean, I really care about, I want to have a conversation about my kids or my family or something in Cuba. And then you respond to that by, again, opening yourself up. So you're forgiving, but you're not a patsy, right? You're not going to keep putting yourself out there and opening yourself up to the person who just keeps popping your nose with, Trump or, hate Trump, right? Now, when I say you step back, it doesn't mean that you retreat into the other side. I mean, we all have relationships like this, and we all have them in our own families where somebody is way over, we call it past the event horizon. They've been sucked in by one or the other political party. Or maybe they've been sucked in by their job, right? They identified, who am I? I'm a lawyer. And it's like, okay, but really, that's not really who you are, right? It's not really who you are. We can't, when I say to step back, I don't mean to write them off. And when I say step back, I don't mean to say treat them as less than the human being that they are. The flip side of that is that when somebody does open themselves up to you and deal with you as a human being, they may have politics, they may have a job that is not yours, that is very different from you. And what is so crucial is to allow yourself to connect with a human being, even if you have a shared sense of identity and what's important to you, to not let differences in politics or class or job define the relationship. So both those things are really hard, right? And I I talk a big game, but we all are human in the sense that if somebody really thinks something, politically something you think is terrible, I don't like that, and I can argue with that person, and I will. But, I'll talk about my own politics. I think Trump is not qualified to be president. I would never vote for him. I think he's a disaster as a president, and that he breaks us. But I don't hate people who vote for Trump. I really don't. But a lot of people do, and that makes me really sad. And this is what I mean about going over that event horizon. It's staying in the human world, the now, without being a patsy, with still being forgiving, and without hate. Anyway, it's a tall order. I fail as often as I succeed, but that is what I think is required to navigate our way through.
I think your point on saying your opinion about Trump or about anything is so important, because I think that's something I need to work on a lot. Like, you can either go through this world being somebody who's constantly thinking about, well, what comes out of my mouth next could be problematic, or you can surround yourself with people and who understand that all of us are going to say dumb things. All of us are going to say things that might be contentious at times in terms of what they believe. And if the people that understand that are the people you want to be around, but like more and more in our society, and even with people who are our friends, certain of these things, if they come out of your mouth, it becomes a source of conflict. And, I think what you're talking about is so important, because the version of yourself where you're just holding everything back is far, far worse than the version that says what you think, but sometimes says something that's dumb.
Well, remember we talked about the very first, the secret, yeah, it is. It's the secret recipe for success, both for corporations involved in technology, media, and politics, as well as the big political parties. Their secret recipe is engagement. It's not affiliation. It's not, do I have a Twitter account? But it's not, do I have a Thread account? I've got both. I have engagement with Twitter. I am valuable to Twitter. I am not valuable to Meta because I don't use Threads. Engagement is it. It's the same in politics. It's not, are you loosely affiliated? Are you engaged so that you will show up to vote, so that you will give money to their candidates? It's engagement. Right? So underlying everything that I'm talking about is to not give your engagement to a political party. You can favor one or vote for whoever you think is the best candidate. I get it, right? But in the same way that you're not defined by what you do for a living, you're not defined by who you vote for or what political party or policies you favor. The intention is to get you, though, to engage and to define yourself through that. Every day, we all receive dozens, hundreds of messages from corporations, from local parties, demanding that we engage with them. And remember, a rage engagement is just as positive as a mirror or a pleasant engagement. We live in an engagement economy, political economy and money economy. And that's what is, secretly wearing away at all of our brains and making it so much more difficult to have these forgiving yet not patsy relationships with other human beings.
So I want to ask you, part of what you've talked about in terms of being able to engage on challenging issues is who you surround yourself with. And we've talked about that a lot. The other part is how we go about doing it. And obviously, if I come, guns blazing, Biden is a catastrophe or Trump is a catastrophe, that's not going to go well. But do you have any thoughts on how we can better do that? Once we've surrounded ourselves with good quality people, how can we have, better conversations around these issues?
I don't know. Because at the same time, I'm not suggesting to anyone to say what they think, right? I think Biden's awful, and I think Trump is a catastrophe. That's what I think. And that doesn't, you can disagree, you can flip that around, you can have very different, and I don't think you're a bad person. We disagree, right? I have so much more political engagement in me than who I freaking vote for. I think I said this on the last episode, but your vote is the most minute part of your political participation as a citizen. It really doesn't matter. I mean, even if you live in a tight, your vote, this is a whole other situation. It does not matter. What your vote is an expression of your identity. And it's a good one. It's an important one. I'm all for it. I do. I vote. I love voting. But it's my political participation is so much more what the three of us are doing right now, talking about how we live together as citizens. This video podcast, this is political participation. Listening to it and thinking about it, that's political participation. It's not your vote.
Can we call this like should be the new ratioed? It should be your level of participation versus like votes. And you should be ratioed in the sense of how much do you politically participate, not how many votes you cast.
I love that. And I see so much political participation happening in this world that people don't think of as political participation. And
that's a great point. Yeah.
Right. I'm going to, start an after school program for XYZ, or I'm going to, do any sort of, it doesn't have to be philanthropy, right? It could be I'm going to, build a self-sustaining thing. It's not maximizing profits, but it's capitalist to build this, charter school or something like that. And I'm telling you, that's political participation. It absolutely is. And it's the most important political participation compared to giving money to a national candidate who sees you as fodder and feed. Oh, come on. It's not that the national votes don't matter. I know they matter. What matters so much more for our own personal identity and how we make our way through this world and the people we want to be is what we do. Not what we do once every 4 years to, in the vote we take. Anyway, I feel strongly about this.
Just one more. I know we have to get into our mailbag section here because we got some really great questions. I want to ask you about this idea of viewing the other side as evil. That's something that is become an issue everywhere. I was just going to read a quick, we had one of the things I've noticed, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, is shifting from doing an investing podcast, which I do on the other side, to a political podcast, is the comments tend to be a little bit more charged on the on the political side than they were. I guess is a good way to put it. But we got one comment.
Biden investors are evil. Evil.
Well, it hasn't worked out for us very well in the past decade. That certainly is true. So yeah, we got a comment. Biden is demonstrably a terrible president. Trump is demonstrably a better president in spite of the slander from the media. Trump wants to make America great again. Biden wants to make feudalism great again. And yes, leftism is evil. There's a little bit more to it, but I'm curious about, you see that a lot. I saw that on Twitter the other day. I saw somebody saying basically, Trump is a scumbag and anybody who supports Trump is a scumbag. So again, that connection we're trying not to make of the candidate to the people who support the candidate. Separating those things out, I think, is so important. So how can we do a better job of not seeing that other side as evil?
Well, by disengaging with our political parties, right? And it is literally that by creating critical distance and saying, no, I'm not going to listen to you. That means not listening to, Trump and his MAGA speeches. It means not listening to Joe Biden. I still remember, I'm old enough to remember in Philadelphia when Biden gets the speech saying, well, maybe it's not all Republicans, but it's MAGA Republicans that, are a threat to the country and want to destroy the country. Maybe a break. This is the type of speech, political speech, that is weaponized and intentionally driven to make that person whose comments you read think it that way. And I'm not going to change their mind. And this is, we were talking about, can lead to kind of a sense of hopelessness that, we're not going to change this. You're not going to change that guy's mind. You're not going to change the true believers, on the Biden side either. You're just not. What we have to figure out is, how do we avoid losing our farts, going over that event horizon into the black hole of red tribe or blue tribeness. And it's not easy. It's impossible if you're alone. It's, I think, only possible when you make these connections, like we were talking about earlier, of people who will see you as a human being, regardless of what your views are on politics or policies of any sort. So long as you do the same with them and you don't define yourself in those terms. It's absolutely a two-way street. It's reciprocal. But if you can find that relationship, you stick together. And I find that is with anything we humans do, the secret. You find like-minded people, you disengage from those who would do you ill.
One of the things that's been helpful for me is coming from the world of investing. If you get stuck with one opinion and you will not move that opinion, you're dead. Basically, you have to be able to evolve. You have to be able to look at the other side. And, that was an example. Like 10 years ago, you were talking about narrative. I was talking about value investing. You were right. I was wrong. But my ability to embrace what you were talking about was really important. And I think the same thing with politics. Like, I try to say, if there's a candidate I think is just awful, I try to say, well, what would somebody who votes for them, what might they find as a reason to vote for them? I try to come up with some logic. Maybe they have a specific social issue they're a really strong believer in, and maybe that trumps all the other issues. And if you can kind of put yourself in their shoes and you can understand why they support them, to me, that's better, at least, to be able to have a normal conversation and not to view them as evil or not to view them as someone who's not informed properly, but understand where they're coming from.
Well, I totally agree with that last part, right? So, I mean, we're so far past changing people's minds. And anytime people start about, oh, we need to educate somebody, it's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Hey, I want to be educated by someone, right? And no one wants to be educated. It's just this most elitist bullshit thing, right? To say they just need to understand. Let's just explain it to them a little bit better, right? Oh, yeah, no. What I find is that in conversations, I just try to avoid, if somebody leads with that, that's a defection, right? And when we're talking about cooperating and defecting, I mean, if somebody's going to lead with something that they know as well is, they're trying to sniff you out. Are you on the same tribe as I am? And it's like, I'm just not going to play the game. I'm just not going to play the game. And that's the part about not being a patsy. I'm not going to get engaged with them to have that. No, it's like, we can talk about something else. If we can talk about something human, then that leaves an avenue to maybe making a human connection. I'm so maybe that's why I just don't I don't get out much anymore because I would rather stay at home than engage on the politics and on the politics.
There was another comment that came from the forum from Rob H. at the Epsilon Theory forum. And I think it echoes kind of what you're saying. It's like the ability to simmer without boiling over. And it was that Ben had the important point that we do our best not to hate those who vote opposite from us, to accept that most are voting with good intentions. I need to keep this top of mind as a simmering anger at both sides increasingly becomes my default. And I mean, that's such a rich metaphor. I just love the simmer, but it's like in interactions, is it the conscious awareness? Like, this is how high I turn up the pot on my stove to not boil over, but like accept that simmer is just part of the world today.
Yeah, it's pretty hot out there, right? I mean, it's pretty, and it's, like I say, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. Now is the time to find people who are not so engaged in politics that they can't see people beyond their politics. And without being a patsy, without kind of just letting yourself open to go to not speaking your own mind, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you should tamp down you have political views or any views at all. I'm saying it's crucial to find other people with whom you can have a political conversation without it infecting every aspect of your relationship.
So I think we can shift over to the mailbag here, because we had some really great questions in the forum. And the first one was one I actually had when we were going through the episode as well, which is this idea of, can there be good political entrepreneurs? So I was thinking about this, like if we had a upstart candidate who wants to use these entrepreneurial tactics, but doesn't want to use them in some of the negative ways we talked about in previous episodes, I mean, can that be done?
I used to think it could, right? And this is going to sound egotistical, and it was, right? It was like, okay, you're a student of narrative, and you can see the stories and why don't you weaponize some narratives, but do it for good, right? I mean, and this is one of the oldest stories, right? Is that you think, oh, I'm going to get this power or this ring or this, this MacGuffin that lots of other people are going after, but I'm going to use the power for good. And we know how that story ends. We know how that story ends. And so I wrestled with that personally. I think to Matt's point earlier, it's not just people vote with good intentions. I think people get involved in politics mostly for good intentions. They mean well. And if they've got a talent for it and they find that there's a path for it, they think, well, yeah, let me do it, because think of all the good I'm going to do. And power corrupts. That's my view. I don't think there is a top-down solution that does not inherently become corrupted in the pursuit of preserving power, as opposed to using power to do good. Sorry, that probably wasn't the answer you wanted.
No, well, it's the true answer, which is the one we do want.
Can I admit the answer?
Go ahead.
Right, because I have a very different view for local political action, like running for town select person, right? Or, running for a local board. Those positions are almost always service positions. I am all for service positions. My view, though, is that once you get beyond truly local government, it becomes an exercise in ego and the corruption of power as opposed to service. So I just want to make that whole amendment.
So on the next comment we got related to this better versus different thing, which was actually very eye-opening for me when Matt came up with it in the episode. And Tanya and Rob were both talking about it in the forum. And just to highlight some of it, the better versus different message struck me home with me. And she was most taken by the examples which showed the bimodal nature required to get ahead in the current widening gyre. So I know, Matt, you wanted to add a little bit more to that on that whole better versus different versus what you saw in the forums.
So first off, complete respect to Christopher Lochhead for coining that term and forever etching it in my brain. But I think, and he brought it from marketing, and I think it's useful in all marketing, all messaging, political, product, or otherwise. Whenever someone is putting a comparison in front of your eyes, it's this idea that better is forcing the comparison and different is forcing a choice. And understanding that framing in the presentation, in the positioning, to use another marketing term, is the critical part. When we think about in politics, it's this idea of, I said it in the last one, like you win in the wings and then the center's for the king. You move back to the middle. And that's because you have to be different to start. You have to foist the comparison upon the audience. But then once you get to the middle, you want to reduce everything to a comparison of better because you want to just make it like, oh, this is the marginal difference. So better and different. Think about how everything is being messaged to you in those framings. And then just remember that better is forcing a comparison, apples to apples, apples to oranges, or whatever they're distorting it with. And different is forcing a choice, saying, you don't want to eat that apple. You want to come bowling with us today. It's so important when we think about the framing of political messages as they're being crammed down our throats heading into an election year in particular.
As important as it is in thinking about the framing nationally, right? Is as important in thinking about the framing personally.
100%.
Right. Because what I found over the years is I want to be different. Yes, I want to be better at my job, but I also have found it necessary to take a step back and a step to the side to see the world differently, where I'm not defining myself in terms of my job, but I'm defining myself in terms of making and protecting and teaching and the intrinsic enjoyment I get from my path. So yes,
that idea is like to choose the identity to be different, because that is the way you preserve choice. If you just want to be better, you're choosing comparisons. If you want to be different, you're choosing to retain choice. That's actually a beautiful reframe, Ben. Nicely done.
So the next one was also a question I had. I mean, we should probably replace me with some of these Epsilon Theory posters because they have much better questions than I do. But the question was around, can centrists still win a national election? We know they're not going to win the primaries, but if somehow they found their way out of the primaries, to me, just thinking about it without understanding this, I would think, if a very right or left wing person comes out of one primary and a centrist comes out of the other, the centrists would have a good chance because they would capture those people in the middle. But I think that's probably not right. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this idea of, can centrists still win a national election?
Yeah, sure. Sure. I know this is going to come to a shock to a lot of people, but Joe Biden is a centrist. Sorry, but he is. Right. And that's what happened in the Democratic primary this time around, where, it was going to be Bernie. And then comes South Carolina, and you have concerted action by Warren and then Mayor Pete and everyone else to step aside, consolidate behind Biden to beat Bernie, because they were really concerned that Bernie wouldn't be able to beat Trump. So parties do this all the time. And I think that, my view, sadly, we have a system today where, again, the rules have changed such that you're not going to get the incumbent president of whichever party to be challenged. So Biden is set. And on the Republican side, the rules have changed so that you're not going to get a consolidation to stop Trump as the candidate. And if I were a Republican, if I was a partisan Republican, I'd be very disappointed in that, in the same way that partisan Democrats were very disappointed and couldn't imagine the idea of running Bernie Sanders in the last election cycle. Because I think what happens with Trump as another national candidate is he gets smashed again. So, I think that as a partisan Republican, I'm very disappointed that we don't have a set of candidates and structural rules that would allow us to focus on anyone else but Trump as the candidate. I understand if partisan Republicanism is not your thing, if Trumpism is your thing, you think I'm nuts. And similarly, lots of people could think I'm nuts, but I'm telling you, it's the same dynamic today on the Republican side as it was in 2020 on the Democratic side. They were able to come by Bernie didn't have the same power base that Trump did. And so they were able to knock him out and run a more centrist candidate, which is Joe Biden.
Is part of the issue with centrist winning that the strong people in the polls turn out a lot more than the people in the middle? I mean, is that an issue more so than it was in the past?
The issue with centrist candidates not winning is that Bernie Sanders was going to win that primary if the other candidates didn't drop out in favor of Joe Biden. That's the issue, right? It's not that a centrist candidate can't win the general election. It's that a centrist candidate can't become the candidate in a general election with a bimodally distributed electoral base in the absence of changing the rules to prevent that non-centrist candidate like a Bernie from winning the candidacy. Bernie was going to win that.
Just a couple more, but I know we have to wrap up here on time. Lawrence was asking about the changing positions of parties, and he'd kind of pointed out, I won't read the whole thing, but from back in the day of Bill Clinton, there was, a pretty strong border policy from the Democratic Party that was in this thing he sent. And I know in the world of Trump, I mean, some of the positions of the Republican Party have changed pretty significantly. So do you have any thoughts on that and sort of the evolving positions of these parties over time?
Yeah, this is a corollary to what I was describing about how you can measure polarization by looking at the political parties and looking for the legislation that they vote for. Is legislation, is it proposed? Does it get through committee to actually come up for a vote in the first place? And if so, is there overlap between the parties on their voting? And on all of these policies, and so whether it's from a policy perspective, because it wasn't just border security and immigration, it was also on welfare. Oh my God. It was also on cutting taxes, right? And so fiscal policy, internal, border policy, welfare policy, law enforcement policy, all of these things were much more in the middle, and policies would come up and both sides would vote for. So whether it's thinking of it in policy terms, whether it's thinking about it in the legislation form, whether it's thinking about it in terms of voting pattern form, all of these things have moved farther and farther apart. It's all part of the widening.
I think that's probably a good one. I had one more myself I was going to ask, but I think we should focus on the forum people for now, and I'll slip mine into a future episode. But I think we're going to test Matt's elite summarizing skills right now because we've covered a lot in this episode.
We covered a lot, but we got notes, baby. So, all right. So best attempt at summarizing this episode. Keep the emails coming. Keep the comments coming. The forum. Find us on our socials. It's all in the comments. I have a feeling we have many more optimism and mailbag episodes to come with this. So here's the summary. Self-interested people. The self-interest is what pushes us beyond our common ground, even though the people prefer the common ground. So that self-interest is the same thing that's going to push us apart as be the thing that can tie us back together. And that lays into the job does not define you. And making sure you understand your identity is not defined by that thing, that you have a choice. And I think this is going to keep coming up over and over again in these notes. Mm-hmm. Our identity is not defined by politics. And you brought up the point, Ben, of sort of transactional versus relational, where transactional is what contributes to the widening gyre. It's using people as instruments, versus relational, which is where we're tightening, we're using our self-interest to actually find the middle ground, to find our pack, to be cooperative, to play an infinite game. We want to, I love this expression, forgive, but don't be a patsy. The best possible relationship is one that's safe, vital, and repairable. And what's critical there is that means to be repairable, to be vital, to be safe, we have to, on both sides, be willing to forgive. But at the same time, we can't be a patsy, because then we get steamrolled over and we end up right back where we started. The secret recipe to success is always engagement. It's who shows up and why. So you don't want to give your engagement towards others in exchange for your identity. I'm thinking of, there's that great thing with the Oracle of Delphi on the outside. Everybody knows it says, know thyself. But on the inside, when you walk through, it says, thou art. Know yourself, but know who you are from the inside. The ratio of your political participation to who you vote for, you got to be thinking of this. Your actions are more important than their labels. Again, your actions more important than their labels. And finally, I just love that, the idea of simmer, but don't boil over. Power corrupts. And so the answer to simmering without boiling over only comes through service. And service, Ben, I love the way you said it. It's, instead of choosing better, choose to be different, because that's what preserves your ability to choose. And that's the most important thing. Jack, you brought it up several times about your identity actually evolves over time. It's not hard, fixed, and brittle. And if I can invoke one music reference for this episode, I want to invoke the poet philosopher, perhaps you've heard of him, Coolio. I'll self-censor on this, but I believe the quote was, if you can't take the heat, get the expletive out the kitchen. We on a mission. And I'm pretty sure, gentlemen, we're on a mission. This is breaking news. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you're watching breaking news so more people can find our show. If you know another clear-eyed and full-hearted individual, why not share this episode with them too? Like we said at the top, the media is making us tick, and it's our job to talk. Follow the headlines at fiatnews.com. Follow Ben at epsilontheory.com and at Epsilon Theory on Twitter. Follow Jack at validiacapital.com and at Practical Quant on Twitter. Follow Matt at sunpointinvestments.com, cultishcreative.com, and at cultishcreative on Twitter. Ben Hunt is the co-founder and CIO of Second Foundation Partners. Jack Forehand is a principal at Validia Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Second Foundation Partners, Validia Capital, or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of Second Foundation Partners, Validia Capital, or Sunpoint Investments. Nothing in this podcast is investment advice.